Chapter 1.8.11 Kubernetes API Server Bypass Risks. The Kubernetes API Server is the primary interface for external users and services to interact with a cluster. It has built-in security controls such as audit logging and admission controllers. However, there are methods to bypass these controls by modifying the cluster configuration or content. This article outlines how these security controls can be circumvented, enabling cluster operators and security architects to implement proper restrictions. It emphasizes the importance of understanding and addressing these vulnerabilities to maintain the integrity and security of the Kubernetes environment. The kubelet on each node in a Kubernetes cluster can load and manage manifests stored in a specific directory or fetched from a URL as static pods. These static pods are not managed by the API server, making them vulnerable to attacks if an attacker gains write access to the source location. Although static pods are restricted from accessing other objects in the Kubernetes API, they can perform security-sensitive actions such as using host path mounts. By default, the kubelet creates a mirror pod to make static pods visible in the API, but an attacker may be able to hide a pod by using an invalid namespace name. To mitigate risks, only enable static pod manifest functionality if necessary, restrict file system access to the manifest directory, and regularly audit access to these locations and kubelet configuration files. For more information, refer to QBM issue MRFIF 41. The kubelet provides an HTTP API on port 10 and 250 on worker nodes, potentially on control plane nodes as well. Access to this API can expose pod information, logs, and execute commands. RBAC access to node sub-resources authorizes interactions with the API. Direct API access bypasses admission control and audit logging, allowing attackers to potentially bypass controls. The kubelet API can authenticate requests in various ways, with most providers using webhook or certificate authentication instead of default anonymous access. Mitigations include restricting access to node sub-resources with RBAC, limiting access to the kubelet port to trusted IP addresses, ensuring kubelet authentication is set to webhook or certificate mode, and disabling the unauthenticated read-only kubelet port on the cluster. These measures help secure the kubelet API and prevent unauthorized access. Kubernetes clusters utilize etcd as a data store, with the etcd service operating on TCP port 2379. Access to the etcd API should be limited to the Kubernetes API server and backup tools to prevent disclosure or modification of cluster data. Client certificate authentication is typically used to manage access to the etcd API, with certificates issued by trusted certificate authorities granting full data access. Direct etcd access bypasses Kubernetes admission control and is not logged by audit logging, making it a potential security vulnerability. Attackers with access to the API server's etcd client certificate private key could gain cluster admin rights. Mitigations include restricting access to the etcd port, controlling access to certificate private keys, and ensuring that certificates are used only for their intended purposes. Implementing authorization for the etcd API and limiting access to trusted IP ranges can also enhance security. Container Runtime Socket. Access to containers on each node in a Kubernetes cluster is controlled by the container runtime, typically exposed through a Unix socket that the kubelet can access. An attacker with access to this socket can launch new containers or interact with running containers. The impact of this access at the cluster level depends on the data accessible by the compromised containers. Mitigations include tight control of file system access to container runtime sockets, restricting access to the root user, isolating the kubelet using Linux kernel namespaces, forbidding the use of host path mounts for container runtime sockets, setting host path mounts as read-only, and restricting user access to nodes, especially superuser access.